The mop bucket rolled across the polished floor of the federal building's lobby. Security guards barely glanced up from their monitors. Late shift workers hurried past with their coffee and briefcases. And in the corner, beneath the flickering fluorescent light, a maintenance man in navy coveralls quietly wiped down the same stretch of marble he'd cleaned every night for 12 years. His name tag read Frank. No last name, just Frank. But when the young Marine recruiter walking through the lobby mentioned Nightwatch to his colleague, Frank's hand stopped mid-motion on the mop handle. His shoulders tensed, and for just a moment, his eyes darted toward the exit, like a man calculating distance and cover. The recruiter didn't notice, but the building's head of security, watching from his office, did. Frank Kowalski was 62, gray-haired and invisible. He arrived at 10 p.m. sharp, worked alone until dawn, and left through the service entrance without a word to anyone. In 12 years, he'd called in sick exactly twice. He knew every security camera angle, every blind spot, every emergency protocol better than most of the guards who'd been there half as long. The other maintenance workers figured he was just thorough, maybe a little obsessive, the kind of guy who lined up his cleaning supplies in perfect rows and checked the same door locks 3 times before moving on. What they didn't know was that Frank still woke up at 0300 every morning, even on his days off, that he kept his apartment sparse, a bed, a table, 1 chair, and a foot locker under the window that he never opened when anyone else was around, that he paid his rent in cash every month, exactly on time, and that sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he'd pause by the building's memorial wall, the one honoring federal employees killed in the line of duty, and his lips would move silently, like he was reciting names. Tom Bradley, the head of security, had been watching Frank for months now, not because he suspected anything criminal, but because small things didn't add up, like the way Frank moved through the building, not shuffling like most janitors, but with purposeful, measured steps. The way he instinctively positioned himself near walls and exits during shift changes. How he never seemed startled by sudden noises, just alert. Tonight, after the Marine recruiter left, Bradley decided to take a walk. He found Frank in the basement, methodically checking the mechanical rooms. Standard protocol. But when Bradley appeared in the doorway, Frank's hand had already moved to his belt, to where a sidearm would rest, before relaxing. "Evening, Frank." "Mr. Bradley." Frank's voice was steady, polite, always polite. "Mind if I ask you something?" Frank continued wiping down a pipe joint, but Bradley caught the slight hesitation. "You prior service?" "Everyone asks that eventually." "That's not an answer." Frank straightened, meeting Bradley's eyes for the first time in months. "Army, long time ago." "What unit?" The pause stretched longer this time. "Nothing special, just did my time." But Bradley had been a cop for 20 years before this job. He knew the difference between someone hiding shame and someone protecting secrets. 3 weeks later, during the evening shift change, alarms started screaming. A water main had burst in the sub-basement, flooding the server room that housed critical federal databases. Emergency protocols kicked in. The building went into lockdown mode while engineers raced to save millions of dollars worth of equipment. In the chaos, no one noticed Frank, until he appeared in the flooded basement, knee-deep in water, helping coordinate the evacuation. While others panicked, Frank moved with calm precision, directing people away from electrical hazards, using his maintenance knowledge to locate emergency shutoffs, and organizing the bucket brigade to protect the most critical equipment. "Who put him in charge?" shouted the lead engineer, but he was following Frank's directions anyway. "That's Frank," Bradley called back, watching in amazement. "He's maintenance." But Frank wasn't just maintenance. Not the way he was assessing structural damage, calculating evacuation priorities, and coordinating with first responders like he'd managed crisis situations his entire life. Not the way he kept mental track of every person entering and leaving the dangerous area. When the crisis passed and the water was pumped out, Frank was already back to cleaning his mop bucket like nothing had happened. But the emergency response team was buzzing about the mysterious janitor who'd kept them organized when everything went sideways. "Where did you learn crisis management like that?" Bradley asked later. Frank was already putting on his coat, ready to leave. "Common sense," he said quietly. But as he walked toward the exit, he paused by Bradley's desk. "That Marine recruiter who was here last month, he mentioned what unit he was from? 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. Why?" Frank nodded slowly. "Good unit. They still teaching kids about situational awareness?" "I imagine so." "Frank, night, Mr. Bradley." The next morning, Bradley made a phone call to his old partner from the police force, Danny Martinez, who'd gone federal after retirement and now worked Veterans Affairs. "I need a favor, Danny. Got a guy here. Prior Army. Something's not adding up." "What kind of not adding up?" "The kind where a janitor handles a crisis like a seasoned commander, but claims he was nothing special in the service." "Name?" "Franklin J. Kowalski. Probably served late 80s, early 90s based on his age." A long pause. "Kowalski, give me a day. I'll ask around." The call came back the next evening. "Tom, your janitor served in military intelligence. Task Force 7. I can't get details, but my contact went quiet when I mentioned the name. Said some of those guys from that era, they did work that stayed classified, deep classified." "What kind of work?" "The kind where they change your identity when you get out. The kind where your service record gets buried so deep that even the VA has trouble finding it. Tom, if this guy is who I think he didn't just serve his country. He disappeared for it." Bradley hung up the phone, staring at the security monitor showing Frank methodically cleaning the lobby at 2 a.m. Task Force 7. He'd never heard of it, but the way Danny's voice had changed when he said the name told Bradley everything he needed to know. That evening, Frank arrived for his shift as usual. Mop bucket, cleaning supplies, the same Navy coveralls. But Bradley was waiting in the lobby, holding 2 cups of coffee. "We need to talk." Frank's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Bradley could see him cataloging exits, assessing threats, calculating response times. Even now, even here, Frank was still on mission. "About what?" "About why someone with your kind of training is mopping floors in a federal building." Frank set down his bucket slowly, never taking his eyes off Bradley. When he spoke, his voice was different, harder, more direct. "What makes you think I have any particular kind of training?" "Last week, for starters, but also the way you move, the way you think, the way you handled that crisis like you'd been trained for it your whole life." Bradley held out one of the coffee cups. "And the phone call I made yesterday." Frank's eyes narrowed, but he accepted the coffee. A peace offering. "What kind of phone call?" "The kind where an old cop friend who works Veterans Affairs goes very quiet and tells me some questions are better left unasked." For a long moment, Frank said nothing. Then he sat down heavily in one of the lobby chairs, looking suddenly older than his 62 years. "Task Force 7 ended 24 years ago," he said quietly. "Officially, it never existed." "What was it?" Frank stared into his coffee cup, gathering his thoughts, or maybe deciding how much truth he could share. "Counterintelligence. Deep operations in Eastern Europe, 87 to 91. We were the people who made sure certain information never reached the wrong hands during the Soviet collapse." He looked up at Bradley. "When things ended, some of us couldn't just come home. Too many people knew our faces in places where that was dangerous. So they gave you new identities, new names, new histories, new lives. The price of keeping certain secrets safe." Frank's voice was steady, but Bradley caught the weight behind the words. "I was Staff Sergeant Franklin Kowalski. When I got out in 92, Franklin Kowalski ceased to exist and became Frank the janitor." Frank smiled. the first real smile Bradley had ever seen from him. But it was a sad smile, weighted with years of carrying secrets. Became Frank the night security specialist, he corrected, because this building processes immigration files, federal employee records, and sensitive administrative data. It looks boring from the outside, but it's exactly the kind of target that needs watching. He stood up, picking up his mop bucket again. Someone's got to keep the night shift secure, Mr. Bradley. Someone who knows what to look for, who understands how vulnerable these quiet places really are. He paused at the elevator, looking back. Besides, after all those years in the shadows, there's something peaceful about work that actually helps people, even if they never know it. As the elevator doors closed, Bradley understood. Frank wasn't hiding from his past. He was still living it, still serving, still on watch. The footlocker in his apartment probably contained commendations he'd never been allowed to display for missions in countries that officially never happened. The names he recited at the memorial wall weren't just fallen federal employees. They were teammates who died in operations that would never be declassified. The next night, Bradley found a small American flag pin on his desk. No note, no explanation. But when he looked up at the security cameras, he saw Frank in the basement, methodically checking the mechanical rooms as always. Still on watch, still protecting, still serving. Some soldiers never really come home, Bradley realized. They just find new battles to fight. Over the following weeks, things changed subtly in the federal building. Bradley began noticing details he'd missed before. How Frank's cleaning routes were actually sophisticated patrol patterns that covered every vulnerable entry point. How he developed an uncanny ability to spot when someone was acting nervous or out of place, long before they became a problem. How the building's incident reports had dropped to nearly zero since Frank's arrival 12 years ago. Not just from better maintenance, but from better observation. The other security guards started treating Frank differently too, though they couldn't quite put their finger on why. Maybe it was the way he'd handled the flood crisis, or maybe Bradley's newfound respect was contagious. But Robot Frank became just Frank. And when the night shift gathered for their brief daily meetings, they found themselves unconsciously asking for his quiet assessment of any security concerns. Most telling of all, Frank seemed lighter somehow. Not happier exactly, but more at peace with himself. As if 24 years of carrying the weight of unacknowledged service had finally found some small measure of recognition. He still arrived at 10 p.m. sharp and left through the service entrance at dawn. He still recited names at the memorial wall, but now sometimes Bradley would catch him standing a little straighter as he walked through the lobby, not like a janitor trying to be invisible, but like a soldier who finally remembered that his watch hadn't ended. It had just changed location. Some soldiers never really leave the service. They just find new ways to serve. In quiet hallways, behind maintenance closets, in the spaces between what we see and what we never think to look for, the mission continues, even when no one's watching. Especially when no one's watching. He mopped floors for 12 years, invisible to everyone who passed by, until the moment they needed him most. If you believe every kind of service deserves recognition, subscribe to Echo Bravo, because some soldiers never stop being soldiers. They just change their uniform.